my argument is that before you get even to the question of, sort of these really decisive choices, Jesus as the Son of God or Muhammad as seal of the prophets, right? A Buddhist vision of nirvana or a Christian vision of heaven. Like those choices are distinct. They're distinct from one another. But before you get there, you can say to yourself reasonably, look, if I can accept that there's probably some kind of God who created the universe, has some kind of plan for human beings, then I think it's okay to say probably this God is not out to get us, right? This God is not setting up this impossible thing where there is one true religion, but guess what? It's practiced by 6 tribesmen in eastern Siberia, and you're never going to figure it out. Sorry, sucks to be you, right? No, you can reasonably assume that religions that develop, endure, win converts, survive amid challenges and competition and secularization and so on, are in general probably closer to the truth about the universe than, let's say, a random startup cult in a basement in, San Diego or something, right?
We don't want to live in the Village Green at the end of the day. We can all leave and return to our houses of worship, but our goal is to encourage conversational theology in the Village Green, where we can rub shoulders with Christians from different traditions and expressions. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to have a conversation with Ross Douthat. I've been looking forward to this, especially after reading his latest book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Ross is a New York Times opinion columnist, a leading intellectual today, and he's the host of the Interesting Times podcast at the New York Times, and a Roman Catholic who we're going to try to bring, back into the fold. You just kind of skipped over. You went charismatic, Episcopal, Roman Catholic. We're going to try to bring you back to the center there, Ross, if possible.
It's true. First, thank you so much for having me. And it's true that as a kid, we went on a tour of American Christianity, but we did not have a reformed, confessional Calvinist phase, as far as I can remember. There's always the possibility that there was a hazy couple of months,
while you were asleep
of hardcore Calvinism.
Yeah.
Maybe a sojourn in Moscow, Idaho, though that wasn't. I don't think that was a going concern back then. But yes, no, I'm here to be instructed.
Oh no, we're on the learning end here. You recently participated in the Free Press debate. Does the West need a religious revival? And your opening statement, if I can just quote it here, it's a good chunk, but it's a good way into this, I think. Do away with faith, the New Atheists argued, and the world will become a better place. Believe in God. That old North Korean dictator in the sky literally poisoned everything. Religious fundamentalism stood in the way of scientific progress. Religious moralism stood in the way of personal liberation. Belief in an imaginary sky daddy was a source of pointless polarization. And we listened to them. We ran the experiment. America in 2025 is more secular than the America of 20 years ago. Religious affiliation has declined. Fewer Americans associate with religious tradition than at any point in our modern history. And how's it going? Is America happier, less polarized, more inclined to understanding those with different worldviews and perspectives, more confident in scientific and academic authority, more reasonable? Listeners, I think, might be able to answer this question for themselves, but why don't you explain a little bit more your reason for asking this question, because I believe it really sets up the whole purpose of your book.
Yeah, so we've lived in the United States through a period of, we can debate a term like secularization, but let's call it a period of de-churching. And it's sort of a second wave. There was a first wave of de-churching after the 1960s. That sort of took American church going down from what had been kind of an all-time high in the 1940s and 50s, right? It was not actually the case in American history that the country started out religious and just became progressively more secular. In fact, of course, there were awakenings and revivals and ups and downs, but really the trend in church membership and sort of the strength of churches and religious institutions was mostly upward until the middle of the 20th century. And then you get a sharp decline in the 60s and 70s, a leveling off, and then a new decline that we've just gone through. And this decline wasn't caused by the new atheists, the writers I was talking about in that statement, but they certainly helped hurry it along. And they did make a set of pretty concrete claims about how much better the world would be if America became less Christian, less religious, less inclined to practice and pray and believe in an invisible God. And I think we're at a point now, I think especially since COVID, I think COVID sort of was kind of a point of cultural demarcation where no one believes in that narrative anymore. No one thinks that a less religious America is a more enlightened and happier America. And so there's plenty of people who miss religion, even if they don't believe in it. There's a large population of younger people, especially, who have been raised without any connection with organized religion, not Christmas and Easter, not a little Sunday school, just nothing, flat nothing.
They're not angry. They're not angry.
And they're not angry. They're not alienated.
Yeah.
They don't have, a history of bad experiences with nuns, wrapping their fingers with rulers or, anything like that. They just, don't sort of know the first thing about what is religion? Why might someone be religious? What does that mean in practice? And so the book, the book is sort of written for everyone, of course. The subtitle is Why Everyone Should Be Religious. So it's a book for everyone. But in terms of sort of who it's speaking to most directly, it's people first in the camp that thinks, well, it would be nice to be religious, but you just can't get there without setting too much of reason and science aside. And then the second group of people who are like, I'm interested in religion, but tell me more about it. Why might someone take religious ideas seriously? And what might one do with one's life, absent a kind of road to Damascus experience, right? So absent a kind of direct conversion. You're just a person trying to set out on a religious pilgrimage. What are the landmarks you're looking for? What kind of choices might you
And
make?
they're against the dogmatism of the new atheists. That's an old story now, right?
I think so. I mean, look, it's a big and complicated country, right? And there are still plenty of people out there who have had bad experiences with religion, who have angrily rejected it or intellectually rejected it. I write a column for the New York Times. The New York Times has many secular readers. If you dig into the comment threads on some of my religious columns, you will find plenty of people who sound a lot like Richard Dawkins at his peak. But if you're talking about the trend, like where is the culture going, then I think absolutely it's going to a place of spiritual and religious interest that doesn't carry with it any sense of sort of the historic Christian or Abrahamic or anything past, really. And that's, for Christians, right? Protestants and Catholics, Reformed and Roman alike, that's a zone of opportunity. But it's also, and this I think goes to some of your own writing and interest, it's also a zone of peril, right? Because there's a lot of people sort of setting out into the spiritual landscape without a map, without any guidance, sort of just opening themselves up to all different kinds of spiritual experience, which some of it positive, some of it dangerous. And there's definitely, I think, an impulse towards looking for what you might call small g gods in this environment. So not Yahweh or Jehovah, and not even, Allah or the Brahman, not even some sort of ultimate divine principle from a non-Christian religion, but more like, what is an intermediate power that can help me in my life? And you see that in neo-paganism. You see it in the vogue for psychedelic religious experiences. You see it in, I think, the UFO fascination. And you see it a bit, this is more scientific than religious, but a bit in what people are looking for from AI. So in that sense, the traditional religions and Christianity above all are sort of in competition with more individualistic, personalized forms of religious faith that, from a Christian perspective, are in danger of, let's just say, directing worship in the wrong direction.
Autonomous individualism sounds like it's at the heart of this, right? You make a great argument for, you can't play soccer alone. You really emphasize that you need to kind of get in the water, get in the game, don't sit on the sideline saying that, any effort to sort of get in a game, that might strike people at first. As I was reading it, I was thinking, is he advocating some kind of religious syncretism? And as you read on, it's like, no, it's concentric circles. You're starting where people are. You're trying to invite people into the game of religion. C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, you are kind of mere religion.
It's one. Well, Lewis is, look, context matters, right? Lewis is writing in an environment that is, this is, 60 or 70 years ago, but maybe more than that now. We're all getting older, but he's writing in an environment where secularization has taken hold. People have left religion behind, but clearly the religion they have left behind is Christianity, right? And the viable
disaffected Anglicans.
Right, exactly. The viable religious options in C.S. Lewis's England were Christian options. So he didn't, in some of his books, he does get into a bit some sort of interreligious ideas. He talks about the Tao. I think, is that in The Abolition of Man? The sort of like, sort of universal principles of morality that show up in different religions. So he does a bit of that. But basically, he as a writer can take for granted that if he can talk someone into, believing in God, their only live option is Christianity. And that's not true in 21st century America. And so you are sort of starting out at a more basic level, mere religion. And you also have to sort of take for granted that a lot of, there are people who are going to become interested in religion and are going to convert to Christianity straight away. And then there are people who are going to go on more complicated and tangled journeys. And I think Christians, there is a sort of openness in my book to the presence of God in other religions. And that is a sort of, in its own way, a kind of liberal idea coming from a conservative Catholic. But I do take that seriously. And I think Christians have to take seriously that they're going to be speaking to people who are sort of moving through, who are confronted with a really wide array of religious options, and who are going to sort of, if they come to Christianity, sometimes they're going to come to Christianity through like several different way stations along the way.
That's what really impressed me, that you really take the reader through those way stations. It's not like you leave them there and just, you do argue that Christianity is the truest destination, but you don't say that up front. You're kind of drawing people into it. You talk about the big religions, which I found interesting. If you're going to start, one, do it together. Do it, a community that's been around for a long time. Join it, check it out, just stew in it for a while. Why the big religions?
Well, so this is an answer to a really, really commonplace complaint that I hear a lot from people who are not religious, sort of, not hardcore atheists, open to religion, right? But their view, because we live in this pluralist society where just through the internet alone, you have access to basically every religion extant in the world today, right? And so they say, look, come on. How can you possibly imagine that out of, 1,217 religious possibilities, you have the truth? And how can you possibly hope to find the truth setting out into a world where there are so many different competing religious possibilities? And my argument is that before you get even to the question of, sort of these really decisive choices, Jesus as the Son of God or Muhammad as seal of the prophets, right? A Buddhist vision of nirvana or a Christian vision of heaven. Like those choices are distinct. They're distinct from one another. But before you get there, you can say to yourself reasonably, look, if I can accept that there's probably some kind of God who created the universe, has some kind of plan for human beings, and the first part of my book is trying to walk people through the scientific and philosophical and historical reasons to take that basic idea seriously, right? So if I've persuaded them to take that basic idea seriously, then I think it's okay to say probably this God is not out to get us, right? This God is not setting up this impossible thing where there is one true religion, but guess what? It's practiced by 6 tribesmen in eastern Siberia, and you're never going to figure it out. Sorry, sucks to be you, right? No, you have to assume, or you don't have to assume, but I think you can reasonably assume that religions that develop, endure, win converts, survive amid challenges and competition and secularization and so on, are in general probably closer to the truth about the universe than, let's say, a random startup cult in a basement in, San Diego or something, right? That in the end, you have to make a choice between Christianity and Islam. Absolutely. But Christianity and Islam together are both a lot more likely to be true than a random faith that went extinct in the 16th century somewhere. If God is real and if human beings have, some actual role to play in God's plan, I think it is okay to narrow your religious options in a substantial way. And then it's also okay to say, okay, I don't have to figure out the answer to every single theological controversy to start out on a journey, right? So people will say, well, okay, Christianity or Islam, but there's so many kinds of Christianity. There's, the endless jokes about, you're this kind of Baptist, but you're that kind of Baptist, right? And it's obviously lots of different kinds of Islam too, but it's like if you're starting out thinking about politics, right? For instance, there are many different kinds of conservatism and there are many different kinds of liberalism, but it's still okay to start out and say, I'm probably a conservative or I'm probably a liberal before you sort of obsess over the specific differences between the 16 kinds of Baptists. Again, not to say those distinctions are unimportant, but you shouldn't imprison, there's a lot of people who just get stuck in a kind of indecisive
Paralyzed.
agnosticism because they're like, well, there's 17 Methodist, 17 churches in the town green. How am I going to pick one? And they're like, well, you can make it easier on yourself to begin with and trust that providence is going to be helpful to you once you begin a quest that providence obviously wants you to begin.
The first part of your book clears away the brush, first of all, on the whole question of Christianity or religion and science. So science has debunked Christianity. That's why I can't join it. How do you respond?
I mean, I think the things that people treat as the debunkings, in particular, Copernicus and Galileo and Darwin, right, are absolutely moments when there was conflict between particular scientific arguments and particular Christian teachings. And I think the conflict was sharper with Darwinism, which is why it remains a conflict. I don't talk a lot about evolution in the book, in part because I don't think we've actually sort of come to the end of Christians arguing about evolution and its implications. I think it does raise some naughty theological KONTTY, but some theological issues about Genesis and the fall, not insoluble issues, but real issues, right? So it is absolutely the case that science can raise issues for particular theological doctrines. I would never say that that's not the case. The claim, though, that science has disproven the broad Christian perspective on the world, that there is a creator God outside time and space who made the heavens and the earth, who ordered all things with human beings in mind, who intervenes in human history in decisive ways. One, none of that has been debunked by any scientific investigation. Two, portions of that perspective, the initial part about God as a creator and orderer of the universe, have been confirmed and strengthened, I think, in a variety of different ways by the progress of modern science, not just the basic structure and design of the universe, but the incredible fine-tuning of the universe's laws to allow for the emergence of planets and stars and human life. All of that is something we know more about now than we ever have before, and it's actually pushed atheism and materialism into this weird cul-de-sac where they are the strict materialist is now required to believe in an infinity of invisible universes, the so-called multiverse, in order to avoid believing in a single invisible God. then also I think what you have with consciousness, not just the resilient mystery of consciousness, but the fact that consciousness is capable of penetrating the larger mysteries, understanding the cosmos, understanding its laws and its ordering and so on. That seems to me like confirmation of the basic Christian idea of human beings made in the image of God. That God is the designer of the superstructure, and we participate in the divine nature insofar as we can understand those structures and split the atom and potentially, for better or worse, rewrite our own genetic code, all of this stuff. Finally, this is less a scientific point than a sociological and historical point. I think people in these arguments don't give enough weight to the resilience of religious and spiritual experience. And probably this is the consequence of what I mentioned before, my own sojourn in Pentecostalism as a kid. But really, from an atheist materialist perspective, it is quite surprising how completely and thoroughly religious and mystical experience has persisted under more secularized conditions, where you don't have churches telling everyone what to believe, making people read Bible stories about miracles and so on. And in fact, there's endless case studies of people who have no religious beliefs whatsoever, including militant atheists, having, strange, fascinating, bizarre, supernatural experiences. I think there's just a plethora of basic evidence that if there is a higher power, the higher power is interested in us. Even before you get to a specific big question like, did the incarnation and the resurrection happen? Just as a general matter, right? And this is all sort of, when St. Paul is preaching to the pagans, he says something to the effect of, I'm here to tell you about God's revelation, the most important thing, but there was already enough evidence out there for you to have some kind of belief. And the first part of my book is basically trying to set out what that evidence is. What is St. Paul talking about in the context of our 21st century knowledge?
Especially in such a brief space.
It's not
so concisely summarize those arguments.
Hopefully.
Very, very helpfully.
Here at Sola, we're passionate about drawing on historic Reformation theology to equip thoughtful Christians for practical wisdom, connecting the dots between the Bible, doctrine, the Christian life, and contemporary culture. All that we produce is free thanks to the many who give monthly as Sola partners. If you join us as a monthly partner, we'll send you a complimentary copy of Michael Horton's book, Ordinary: Sustainable Faith in a Radical, Restless World. In an age marked by burnout and sensationalism, Horton shows us what it looks like to live a deeply normal, yet profoundly meaningful Christian life. To get your copy, simply head over to solamedia.org/partner to join us in encouraging even more people to grow in knowing God and seeing everything in His light.
One of the things that strikes me, Ross, is how many scientists today are not represented at all by Dawkins. They are, even hardcore materialists are trying to argue for materialism in a spiritual kind of way. They're trying to spiritualize matter. Panpsychism. You refer to panpsychism, and I've been reading on panpsychism and the folks working on AI and transhumanism and so forth. It's almost like shifting from organized religion, which we don't like, to science fiction spiritualism, retrieving a kind of Neoplatonic mysticism of an Aristotelian kind of panpsychism that we thought was over. That even Orthodox Christians shy away from.
I mean, my sense is that that's truer of, I guess you could say, atheist philosophers right now than it is of practicing scientists. I think a lot of practicing scientists, again, not Richard Dawkins-esque scourges of religion, but are sort of deep enough in their disciplines that they're content with a conventional materialist paradigm because it's what guides their scientific work, right? So it's the people who are lifting up a bit, who are philosophers of science, sometimes neuroscientists, but often sort of philosophers of neuroscience who are lifting up and looking at the big picture and saying, wait a minute, materialism doesn't make sense of any of this. You have these concepts like emergence, right? It's like consciousness is an emergent property. Well, no one knows what emergence means. This is just sort of mysticism, right?
Yeah.
And so you have people like Philip Goff, who's written about panpsychism, Thomas Nagel, the famous philosopher, who again, are not conventionally religious, but are sort of trying to come up with a theory that accepts the resilience of mind as a kind of irreducible fact about existence without going all the way to a capital M mind. I think that's a pretty unstable position to be in. And in fact, Goff, sort of maybe the most prominent panpsychist, keeps flirting with heterodox or heretical forms of Christianity. Nagel, maybe not so much, but yeah, I think there is certainly a sense among a lot of smart people of that materialism is insufficient, and to get to mind and consciousness, something needs to be added to the theory. And you get people sort of flirting with like, well, maybe quantum physics can help us in some way, and like there's some quantum level of reality that generates consciousness or something. I'm pretty underwhelmed by some of those.
Almost sounds like a God of the gaps theory, doesn't it? Not our God of the gaps, but
yes, some of those theories are clearly like we are awaiting a breakthrough in science that will explain. Yeah, it's an atheism of the gaps in that sense. I think the panpsychists, it's more like they are accepting something that I, as a Christian, also believe to be true. They're just not perhaps drawing the correct inference from it. At the very least, I feel like once you are a panpsychist, you should become a pantheist pretty quickly. You don't have to become a classical theist, right? You might still have skepticism that mind can exist outside time and space. But at the very least, once you've stipulated that mind is in everything and all over everything, there's probably then higher forms of mind than just ours, right? Yeah. And I think if I were a panpsychist, I think I would be a pantheist.
Yeah, it makes the most sense. You write, everywhere mysticism is on the march, spiritual experimentation is coming back. My unhappily agnostic correspondents are on the hunt for gnosis, the divine experience, the hidden architecture, the secret truth. This is almost entirely what I'm seeing also in academic histories on the spiritual but not religious phenomenon. And you say this hunt for the divine gnosis and experience is why religion needs defending. I'm curious then, even though new atheism's dying, do you think religion has more or less a chance against the enchantment of sort of new agey therapeutic spirituality? Or was the idea of enchantment developed precisely as an alternative to Judeo-Christian monotheism?
I mean, that's an interesting idea, and I suspect that you are more familiar with that particular history. I do think there are ways in which Christians are sort of obliged to be skeptical of a enchantment frame, right? My own view is that to the extent that enchantment describes something real about the universe, it is something that just sort of is a reality that persists notwithstanding official secular conditions, right? I guess I'd say two things. First, I think in general, what gives religion an advantage over individualized spirituality, apart from questions of truth, right, which are obviously quite important too. If God is on the side of religion, that makes a difference. but setting that aside, I think, one of the things that we're seeing in our society now is that certain forms of hyper-individualism lead just to extinction very quickly. You see this in collapsing birth rates all over the world. You see this, I think, in the ways that various forms of human culture under digital conditions just sort of disappear and vanish, right? And so as much as like the sort of spiritual but not religious mentality clearly has a certain kind of appeal to people who don't want to submit to some kind of traditional religious authority, I think it also struggles to reproduce itself. It needs actual stronger communities to sort of generate the people who it can then convert, right? And that can work for a while, but again, under the conditions of the next 50 years, where I am really worried about, like, sort of not human extinction exactly, but like, whole nations almost disappearing. I think the kind of cultural demographic advantages of religion can become really, really important, right? So you'd certainly bet on like the Amish are going to have a really good 21st century, whereas, people who are building their religion sort of on a purely personalized level, how many kids are those people having? What kind of community are those people building? Now, with this, though, further question, right, to get really sort of weird. So we went through a period like this in certain ways in the 1970s. There was a similar vogue for personal individualized religion, a similar vogue for astrology, magic, psychic powers, all of these kinds of things, right? And that sort of burned itself out, and institutional religion made a comeback, I would say, in the 80s and 90s. So that by the time I was growing up, like, my parents knew their astrological signs, but I didn't know any teenager in the 1990s who knew they were a Sagittarius, right? That was like passe. And crystals, all that stuff had sort of vanished into the New Age bookstores. So you could tell a story where there's just these cycles. And we've been in a kind of spiritual but not religious cycle. But for the reasons I've just suggested, institutional religion will make a bigger comeback in the future. Unless the sort of magical forms of religion or spirituality, whatever, the people doing outreach to small g gods start to get like answers, public manifestations of small d divine power, these kinds of things. Like, if suddenly magic seemed to work, if the AI oracle did seem godlike, if a UFO really descended, then you're in different territory. And this is very speculative, but I don't think that Christians who believe in the supernatural should fully discount the possibility that there might at some point be something really weird that happens that scrambles things, I think.
Having taken people on this great journey from the broader to the narrower, Case for Commitment, you conclude the book with your arguments as to why you think Christianity stands out. Why should a person who is on this religious journey, they're kind of in the library of world religions, as you call it, and why should they take Christianity off the shelf and treat it differently?
I think because the story of the Gospels, before you get to, the whole of the religion, just the Gospels themselves stand out in a really profound way among religious texts and religious stories. In the book, I basically say something like, the same assumption that should lead you to think that probably God is more present in the big religions than in the random ones you've never heard of should also put you on the lookout for cases in the big religions that themselves seem to stand out and command attention. I don't think Christianity has the only case study here, but I think the Gospels really are kind of sui generis among religious texts and religious stories in terms of their combination of historicity, their groundedness in the realities of a period that we actually know a lot about. It's not a mythological period, it's a historical period. In terms of their credibility as memoir and eyewitness testimony, in terms of the distinctiveness of, this is not unfamiliar from Christian apologetics, but it remains true. Mm-hmm. The character of Jesus is distinctive, and the narrative of betrayal, crucifixion, resurrection stands out, and the resurrection itself stands out. To read the Gospels naively, which I think more people will be doing in this context, right? I think is to connect again with just how much this feels like something that really happened, right? Mm-hmm. That like you're reading the Gospels and you're not reading some polished account written 500 years later by the priests of a well-developed religion who are like smoothing out all the rough patches and, making it all fit together theologically. No, you're reading something that is people in the midst of something who don't fully understand what's happening, who are just beginning to try to grapple with it theologically. They're hundreds of years away from the Nicene Creed being formulated, right? And it just feels like reality. And I think here, the difficulty that Christians had for a long time was that the intellectual difficulty was that once sort of Christian cultural hegemony began cracking up, Christianity was associated with institutions and teachings that, for obvious reasons, emphasized the infallibility, indefectibility, sort of the idea of not just Christian doctrines, but the New Testament itself as sort of the perfect word of God, right? And in that climate, like any sort of difficulty in the, it's like, well, there's two different genealogies here. What's going on with that, right? Or, John has the clearing of the temple in this point in the chronology, and, the synoptics have it somewhere else, and so on. Any point of sort of seeming tension or contradiction in the Gospels, in a culture where, you had these institutions making super strong claims, could become a place where the acid of skepticism could enter in. But in our context, where, again, lots of people are just coming to the Gospels fresh, right? I think if you come to them fresh, what's striking is not, there are some tensions and issues here and so on, some questions about, did Matthew get this right, or did Luke get this right, or something, but they read like eyewitness accounts, right? That's the inescapable reality.
So they're kind of coming like the first Christians.
Well, ideally,
yes. Neither as critics nor believers, but we will hear more about this later as they told Paul in Athens.
Yes. Hopefully.
And as they're reading, you're saying as they're reading, they're going to be reading texts that precisely because of discrepancies and different angles, and it's not all smoothed out, and so precisely because of that, as well as other issues, it just has this ring of truth that can bring people along before they get to either believing or criticizing.
Yes. And to me, and this is, I don't want to get too deep into the biblical inerrancy debates, but to me, as a would-be naive reader, you try and, even as a convinced Christian, you try and read the Gospels naively. If one Gospel writer and another Gospel writers had slight discrepancies of memory that produce different accounts, that is in fact what you would expect from eyewitness accounts. Yeah. Whereas a set of Gospels that presented themselves to you completely smoothed out. Oh, guess what? There's no possible tension between these four completely different books by different authors. I mean, yes, in a way you could say, well, that would be better proof of divine inspiration. But if you're analyzing their historical credibility, in fact, I find the discrepancies to be part of the credibility. Anyway,
they didn't get together at the Marriott over a weekend and.
Right. No, they absolutely did not. They were writing them the way you would write something in a context where you were trying to put down, based on your own memories and other people's memories, what you had experienced. That's plainly what happened.
We'll finish with this. A lot of spiritually curious people like Joe Rogan, for example, are interested in consciousness, kind of around the mystical edges, but they don't seem too interested in historical claims like the resurrection and the implications of those historical claims. In the book, you recount a conversation with the late atheist critic Christopher Hitchens in the kitchen, and at a party, he asks you, if Jesus rose from the dead, so what? A lot of people I meet, if you give them evidence, arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, a lot of times they say, so what? Do you believe in UFOs?
So Hitchens didn't say, so what, though. I want to be clear. He said, what would it prove? Which is a bit different. I think there's two slightly distinct attitudes that are both worth wrestling with. One is the one you described, right? Where it's like, there's people who are just never going to be convinced by any amount of evidence, or who seem like they're never going to be convinced. There's always the possibility of divine grace entering in. But people who are just so fully resistant to the idea of the supernatural that it's like, well, if I believed in that, I'd have to believe in anything. And so I have to rule it out. With Hitchens, I had the sense that it was more a kind of sense of like, even if there were weird things in the world, right? And maybe I'm interpreting this wrongly. It was late and we had both had too many drinks. But even if there are weird things in the world, what does it all add up to? And that I encounter a lot, including in the conversations I've had around this book. There's a certain kind of person who's like, I read your stuff about, the design of the universe, and I kind of agree. I think materialism is insufficient, right? But like the concept of God just seems too loaded. And the idea that, a religion could be true seems too much. And I think that's a very potent sense that like there are people who you could persuade that a miracle had happened and they would still say, okay, but like, it's still just totally mysterious to me what's going on in the world. And it's not going to be the resurrection of Jesus for them, right? It's going to be something more personal. Maybe they're going to have a weird mystical experience, which lots of people have and just sort of don't know what to do with. Or maybe they're going to read an argument, maybe mine, someone else's, about religion, and they're going to say, hey, that kind of makes a little bit of sense. I'm saying to them, that's an invitation. You don't have to treat it as like this thing that you just set aside. And this is just the very conventional part of the book's argument. I'm like, you're a mortal creature. Your life is finite. It's time-bound. We're all going to die, right? If there is some kind of mystery to the universe, some kind of creator to the universe, you're going to encounter them probably. And you should take that seriously and do something about it. Doesn't mean you have to, move to Tibet and take up residence on a mountain or something. It can just mean going to church on Sunday, right? It can just mean taking a step toward religion and seeing what happens. But that overcoming that sense of paralysis, I think, is really, really important to any kind of religious restoration.
To anyone who thinks from this interview that you just sort of trail off into a fog of big religions, let's not go to Christianity. That's not the case at all. Here is, in fact, how the book ends. Mark 13:35-36. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. If you are this sleeper, I beg of you, awake. Ross Douthat, it has been a real pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for giving us your valuable time to engage with this intriguing book, Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious.
It's been a pleasure, Mike. Thanks so much for having me.
It's been 500 years since the Protestant Reformation. Dialogue between Catholics and Protestants has improved, but it's still not where it should be. Every day, debates rage online. Scroll through the comments and you'll find misrepresentations, straw man arguments, and recycled sound bites. That's why we wrote What Still Divides Us, a short book that uncovers 4 key questions that still separate Protestants and Catholics today. How are we saved? How does God speak? Who runs the church? How should we worship? We don't need to ignore our differences. We need to understand them, especially if we want real conversations, not just arguments. Get your free copy of What Still Divides Us now, while supplies last, at solimedia.org/offers.